The stone corridor echoes with a sound no wall should contain. A woman's voice, breaking not with tears but with prayer, splinters against limestone as boots descend the stairwell in measured rhythm. She is 23 years old, a bride of Christ. And in 17 seconds the iron door will open, and her vows of chastity, poverty, and obedience will be tested in ways no scripture prepared her for. Her name is Sister Eleni, though by sunset she will be given another, one written not in baptismal records, but in Ottoman ledgers where human beings are catalogued alongside grain shipments and livestock. The air smells of salt and iron. Her hands, calloused from years of washing altar linens and grinding wheat for communion bread, tremble, clutch a wooden cross no larger than her thumb. She hears Turkish voices on the other side of the door, discussing not her fate but her value, whether she knows Greek or Latin, whether she can sew, whether her body can bear. Children, the door opens. This is not a dungeon. This is a processing center. This is not chaos. This is bureaucracy. And what happens next is not an accident of war or the rage of conquest. It is policy. What the Ottoman Empire did to Christian nuns remains one of history's most carefully buried atrocities, a systematic apparatus of degradation that turned sanctity into spectacle and faith into a commodity measured by the pound. Ottoman Empire stretched from the gates of Vienna to the sands of Yemen, from the Crimean steppes to the deserts of North Africa. For over 6 centuries, it stood as one of the world's dominant powers, a civilization of staggering architectural beauty, of poetry and law, of gardens and astronomical observatories. Its sultans commissioned mosques that seemed to defy gravity, their domes floating above cities like captured moons. European ambassadors marveled at its wealth, its efficiency, its ability to govern dozens of ethnic and religious communities under a single imperial canopy. Historians speak of the millet system, a framework of religious autonomy that supposedly allowed Christians and Jews to worship freely under Ottoman protection. They point to periods of coexistence, to shared marketplaces and intermingled neighborhoods, to the supposed tolerance that made the empire a refuge for Jews fleeing the Spanish Inquisition. Story empires tell about themselves, but beneath that shimmering surface lay a darker infrastructure, one built not on tolerance but on domination. One that did not merely conquer territory, but systematically dismantled the spiritual and physical integrity of those it subjugated. And no group bore the concentrated weight of this machinery more completely than Christian nuns. These were not soldiers. They were not political agitators. They were women who had withdrawn from the world to devote themselves entirely to God, to prayer, to healing the sick and teaching the illiterate. They represented the purest expression of Christian devotion, which is precisely why they became targets. The persecution of Christian religious women under Ottoman rule was not a series of isolated incidents or the spontaneous violence of soldiers drunk on conquest. It was institutional. It was codified in law. It was enabled by economic incentives. It was sustained by theological justifications. And it was executed with the same bureaucratic precision the empire applied to tax collection and military logistics. From 1453, when Constantinople fell and became the jewel of the Ottoman crown, until the empire's collapse in the early 20th century, the Christian population of Asia Minor plummeted from roughly 20% to less than 2%. This was not migration. This was not peaceful assimilation. This was erasure, carried out through forced conversion, enslavement, massacre, and the targeted destruction of religious institutions. And at the center of this machinery of obliteration were the convents, those quiet sanctuaries where women lived lives of contemplation and service, utterly defenseless against the apparatus that would consume them. The system began with intelligence. Ottoman administrators maintained meticulous records of every monastery and convent within their territories. They knew how many nuns resided in each, their ages, their resources, even the layout of the buildings. These were not casual observations. They were operational files, prepared with the same care a general applies to mapping enemy fortifications. When raids came, they came with purpose. The convent would be surrounded at dawn, when wet. Prayers were deepest and resistance impossible. Soldiers followed strict procedure. No one was permitted to flee. The buildings were searched for valuables, sacred objects stripped from altars, chalices melted down, icons defaced or destroyed. Then came the selection. The nuns were gathered and categorized with chilling efficiency. The elderly, those past childbearing age or too frail for labor, were often killed immediately, their bodies disposed of in ways designed to maximize terror among survivors. The younger women faced something worse. They were sorted by age, health, education, and perceived usefulness. Those deemed suitable for elite Ottoman households were separated from those destined for manual labor or military service. Each woman's future was determined not by mercy or justice, but by her potential to serve the empire's economic and demographic needs. The first stage of their destruction was the erasure of identity. Religious habits were torn from their bodies, replaced with coarse gray garments or nothing at all. Their heads were shaved, a deliberate mockery of the tonsure, but also a practical measure, a way to strip away the visible markers of their vocation. Their Christian names were replaced with Turkish ones, written into ledgers where they appeared alongside entries for grain, textiles, and livestock. They ceased to be Sister Eleni or Sister Magdalena. They became inventory. Then came the conversion rituals, performances designed not simply to change religious affiliation, but to annihilate the soul. In public squares, before crowds gathered for the spectacle, nuns were forced to renounce their vows. They were made to spit on crosses, to burn their own prayer books, to recite Islamic declarations of faith, while Ottoman theologians watched and recorded their compliance. Those who resisted were tortured, but never killed outright. Dead captives had no market value. The torture was calibrated, scientific in its cruelty, designed to break the will without destroying the body, because the body had uses. In major Ottoman cities, specialized facilities were established to process captured Christian women, particularly from the Armenian, Greek, and Assyrian communities. These were not prisons, in any traditional sense. They were industrial-scale sorting centers, equipped with examination rooms where captives were inspected like livestock. They were measured, weighed, assessed for physical defects, their teeth checked, their reproductive capacity evaluated by physicians who documented their findings with clinical detachment. European diplomatic reports from the late 19th and early 20th centuries described these facilities in horrifying detail. Buildings with narrow chambers, deep drainage channels, heavy restraint fixtures. Architecture purpose-built for sustained captivity and systematic abuse. The very design of these centers, often repurposed warehouses or newly constructed barracks on the outskirts of the outskirts. Cities like Constantinople, Aleppo, and Damascus spoke to a bureaucratic, almost administrative approach to human suffering. The process was methodical. Upon arrival, women were stripped of their personal belongings and the clothes that identify their social status and community. They were assigned numbers, their names erased from official ledgers, their identities systematically dismantled as the first step in their transformation from human beings into assets. The most nightmarish element of this apparatus was the breeding system. Captured nuns, women who had taken vows of lifelong celibacy, were deliberately impregnated to create children who would inherit slave status under Ottoman law. This was not spontaneous violence. It was a calculated policy of demographic engineering. Medical manuals from the period, some commissioned by provincial authorities, describe in chilling detail how to maintain the health of pregnant captives, how to maximize birth rates while keeping the mothers alive for repeated use. Nutrition was managed not for the woman's well-being, but for the health of the fetus. Physical labor was calibrated to avoid miscarriage but ensure docility. The children born from these forced unions were classified at birth in a grim parody of an agricultural selection program. Boys who appeared strong or intelligent were taken for military training, destined for the Janissary Corps or other military units where their Christian origins would be erased through indoctrination. Girls were sorted based on appearance and health, some raised as future breeding stock, others assigned to domestic servitude or the harems of officials. The separation of mother and child was always deliberate and immediate. It served a dual purpose: to crush the maternal spirit, breaking the bonds of family and heritage, and to create a new isolated generation whose only frame of reference was their Ottoman masters. Hope itself was transformed into a weapon wielded against the powerless, as mothers were sometimes promised glimpses of their children in exchange for compliance. The legal and social framework that enabled this horror was explicit and deeply entrenched. Under the Ottoman interpretation of Islamic law, Muslim men possessed unrestricted rights over female captives taken in war or purchased in markets. These women, known as Qaris, existed in a legal gray zone where their personhood was subsumed by their status as property. Sexual violence against such women was not considered a crime. It was viewed as an extension of property rights, a permissible use of a possessed object. The legal principle of forced marriage created a system where rape was not merely tolerated, but endorsed as a mechanism for asserting religious and ethnic dominance over conquered Christian populations. This was not an underground practice. It was visible in the public slave markets, in the households of prominent citizens, and in the tax records that noted the value of such human property. In Ottoman courts, a Christian woman's testimony carried less weight than a Muslim man's, making legal redress a fantasy. Crimes against them, especially against nuns who represented a direct affront to Islamic authority, were almost never investigated, let alone punished. European consular reports from the dying days of the Empire state explicitly that there is no recorded instance of a Muslim being punished for raping, abducting, or enslaving a Christian woman between 1894 and 1924, a period encompassing the Hamidian massacres, the Adana massacres, and the Armenian genocide. The economic underpinnings of this system were equally robust. The trade in captured women and children constituted a significant informal economy, with prices fluctuating based on age, health, beauty, and skills. This market was integrated into the wider Ottoman economy, with proceeds funding local militias, filling the coffers of provincial governors, and enriching slave traders who operated with impunity. The system also functioned as a tool of social control, terrorizing Christian populations into submission by demonstrating absolute power over what they held most sacred: their women, their family, honor, and their future generations. The psychological impact was catastrophic, creating a legacy of trauma, shame, and silenced histories that would ripple through the diaspora for centuries. To understand the system is to understand more than just a history of violence. It is to understand a meticulously constructed architecture of dehumanization, where law, medicine, economics, and social custom were all marshaled to facilitate the eradication of identity and the systematic exploitation of identity and the systematic exploitation of the human body for state and ideological purposes. The physical buildings may have crumbled, but the shadow they cast is long and dark, a stark testament to the depths of organized human cruelty. This was not the failure of law. This was law, functioning exactly as designed. The economic dimension of this system created perverse incentives that ensured its continuation. Nuns fetched extraordinarily high prices in Ottoman slave markets. Their perceived purity, their education, ability to read and write, made them valuable commodities. Wealthy households desired them as status symbols. The result was a feedback loop of exploitation. Raids on convents became profitable enterprises. That profit funded more raids. The cycle perpetuated itself, transforming abuse into an industry that required no imperial directive to sustain, only the promise of profit. Transportation networks were adapted specifically for human cargo. Ships crossing the Aegean had their holds modified, with ventilation slits, not out of mercy, but to keep captives alive long enough to reach market. Caravans moved along designated routes with holding stations at regular intervals. At each checkpoint, officials kept detailed logs, the number of captives received, their condition, their sale price. This was logistics. This was administration. Human suffering reduced to numbers in a ledger, tracked with the same bureaucratic efficiency applied to military supplies or tax revenue. Inside, breeding compounds scattered across the empire. Time lost meaning. Women were isolated, denied their names, forced into cycles of pregnancy and grief. They forgot their prayers. They forgot their language. Some forgot their own names. The empire succeeded not just in conquering their bodies, but in erasing their identities, in consuming everything that made them human and excreting only what served Ottoman economic and demographic goals. When resistance occurred, it was crushed with a theatrical brutality. Escaped nuns who were recaptured faced punishments designed to terrify others into submission. Some were mutilated. Others were buried alive in specially constructed stone pits, narrow shafts designed to prolong suffering while serving as public warnings. Archaeologists have uncovered these sites, their dimensions and construction revealing a disturbing truth. They were built, planned, engineered for maximum psychological impact. The psychological warfare embedded in this system was devastatingly effective. The public humiliation of nuns became a weapon of mass demoralization. Christian villages that witnessed such atrocities often surrendered without resistance the next time Ottoman forces approached. The message was unmistakable. Even God's servants cannot protect themselves. What chance do you have? Entire communities were pacified not through military might, but through the spectacle of sanctity defiled. Yet even within this machinery of annihilation, acts of defiance flickered like candles in a cathedral. Some nuns refused to speak the words of conversion even under torture. Others hid small crosses carved from wood or bone, keeping them pressed against their skin until death. There are accounts of women who chose suicide over submission, leaping from towers or consuming poison rather than allow their bodies to serve the empire's designs. Their deaths were not victories, but they were refusals. And in a system built to manufacture compliance, refusal was revolutionary. In the lower chambers of Topkapi Palace, beneath gardens where sultans once strolled, archaeologists have discovered something extraordinary. A small underground room, barely large enough for 10 people to kneel. Its walls are covered with faint carvings, crosses, circles, bird-like symbols, and one phrase, carved deeper than the rest. Lux in tenebris luceat, the light shines in the darkness. This was a secret chapel, created by captive nuns who refused to let their faith die. They carved it in stolen moments, using fingernails and scraps of metal, etching their prayers into stone when their voices were forbidden. It survived centuries. It survived the empire that tried to erase it. It stands now as testimony not to Ottoman tolerance, but to the resilience of the human spirit when subjected to systematic dehumanization. The archives reveal the scale. Ottoman administrative records list thousands of religious women processed through these systems. French and British consular reports from Syria and Lebanon document similar atrocities against Maronite and Nestorian Christians. Nuns raped or abducted. Monasteries looted. Clergy executed. Women forced to convert under threat of death. This was not isolated to one region or one century. It was empire-wide policy, sustained across generations, normalized to the point where scribes recorded it with the same emotional detachment applied to weather observations or crop yields. By the early 20th century, the Christian population of Asia Minor had been decimated. Over 2 million Christians vanished from the demographic record. Their churches were burned or converted into mosques. Their monasteries were dismantled, their stones repurposed for Ottoman barracks. The small convents that had once dotted the countryside disappeared entirely, and with them disappeared the women who had devoted their lives to prayer and service, consumed by an empire that transformed holiness into humiliation and faith into a marketable commodity. This is not ancient history rendered irrelevant by time. This is history deliberately suppressed, buried under layers of romanticized narratives about Ottoman tolerance and multicultural sophistication. The noun, evidence exists in diplomatic correspondence, in missionary letters, in the ruins of monasteries never rebuilt, in the architectural remnants of processing centers whose purpose can no longer be denied, in the DNA of populations whose genetic records reveal the scars of systematic sexual violence, in the silence that still surrounds this subject, a silence maintained by those who find the truth inconvenient or who fear the moral reckoning it demands. The lesson here transcends the specifics of Ottoman policy or Christian suffering. It speaks to the fragility of civilization itself, to how quickly institutions can transform human beings into resources, how easily moral frameworks can be bent to justify the unjustifiable. It reveals what happens when power operates without accountability, when economic incentives align with cruelty, when theological reasoning is weaponized to sanctify atrocity. Every empire has its monuments. Every civilization celebrates its achievements. But the true measure of a society is not found in its architecture or its poetry. It is found in how it treats the powerless, the silenced, the defenseless. The Ottoman Empire built domes that seemed to touch heaven, but beneath those domes were chambers where women prayed in darkness, where sanctity was systematically destroyed, where faith was tested not by abstract theological questions, but by the concrete brutality of bodies broken and identities erased. And when we celebrate the grandeur without acknowledging the horror, when we speak of tolerance without naming the atrocities, we become complicit in the erasure. We allow the silencing to continue. If this story has left you unsettled, if it has revealed a truth that challenges comfortable narratives about the past, then it has served its purpose. History is not a collection of flattering tales we tell to make ourselves feel sophisticated. It is a record of what human beings are capable of, the heights of nobility and the depths of depravity. And only by confronting the depths can we hope to aspire to the heights. Like this video, not because it entertains, but because it confronts. Share it with those who believe the past has nothing to teach us, with that, those who think atrocities are always somewhere else, committed by someone else. Subscribe to this channel if you believe that the voices of the silenced deserve to be heard, that the crimes of the past must be named if we are to avoid repeating them in the future. Only by stripping history of its disguises, by refusing to let convenience or comfort dictate which truths we tell, can we finally hear the prayers carved into stone by women whose names we will never know, but whose suffering demands to be remembered.